Richard Coleman, a billionaire whose name once shook Wall Street and echoed in every corner of high society. He had everything: money, power, and a family that should have been his greatest treasure. But in a shocking act of pride, he threw out his black wife and their baby, chasing after a new mistress who promised him excitement and status. Richard thought wealth could erase the past. He thought betrayal would carry no consequences. But years later, what happened would shock the world. The very family he abandoned rose higher than he could ever imagine, while his empire crumbled into dust. This is not just a tale of riches and ruin. It is a story of resilience, justice, and the unshakable bond of love. Before we begin, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share powerful stories like this one. Now, let's dive in. The city of New York sparkled with 1,000 lights that night, but none outshone the brilliance of Richard Hamilton's empire. He was one of the wealthiest real estate moguls in America. His name appeared in magazines, his photo on billboards, his voice in business columns. Richard was a billionaire whose life seemed untouchable. But what shocked society most was not his fortune, it was his choice of wife. Her name was Amara Johnson Hamilton, a woman of grace and strength, born far from the gilded walls of high society. Amara was a stunning black woman with rich brown skin, deep soulful eyes, and a warmth that could disarm even the harshest critic. She had grown up in modest circumstances, working her way through school and proving herself as an intelligent, compassionate woman with dreams of helping others. When Richard met her at a charity gala years earlier, he claimed it was love at first sight. Against all odds, against whispers from his peers and the frowns of his elitist family, he married her. To the world, it looked like a fairy tale, a billionaire who dared to follow his heart, not society's rules. Their union was blessed with a child, a baby boy named Ethan. To Richard, Ethan was his heir. To Amara, he was her heart. For a brief moment in time, the Hamilton mansion was filled with laughter, lullabies, and the quiet dreams of a family that was supposed to last forever. But fairy tales are fragile. And behind the glossy magazine covers and red carpet smiles, cracks were already forming. Richard's family never fully accepted Amara. They whispered behind her back at galas, muttered at family dinners, and treated her as though she were an intruder who had stolen her way into their wealthy world. "She doesn't belong here," one of Richard's sisters once hissed at him. "She'll ruin the Hamilton legacy." Richard always brushed them off in the beginning, holding Amara's hand and assuring her, "They'll come around." But as the years passed and the pressure of wealth, power, and ego grew heavier, his grip on her hand loosened. For Amara, the signs were subtle but undeniable. The late nights at the office. The business trips that lasted longer than scheduled. The way Richard's eyes no longer lingered on her the way they once did. Still, she loved him. She believed in the vows they had made, in the promises whispered under the stars on their wedding night. She wanted to believe their love could weather any storm. But she had no idea the storm was already gathering. It was during one of Richard's high-profile business trips to London that temptation crept into his life. The deal was massive, a luxury hotel project that would place his empire in the heart of Europe. For weeks, meetings were held in towering glass offices overlooking the Thames, and every powerful man in the room was accompanied by beautiful women who played their roles as ornaments to the wealthy. That's when Richard met Vanessa Moore. Vanessa was the kind of woman who turned heads the second she entered a room. Tall, slender, with golden hair that caught the light and eyes that sparkled with mischief, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she could bend men to her will. Unlike Amara, who carried herself with quiet dignity, Vanessa was bold, flirtatious, and shamelessly ambitious. She made Richard feel young again. At dinners, she laughed at his jokes louder than anyone else. In meetings, She complimented his brilliance with words that stroked his ego. She whispered promises of adventures, freedom, and passion, things Richard, blinded by pride, thought he had lost in his marriage. The first time they were seen together at a gala, the cameras flashed endlessly. Tabloids speculated she was his business partner. Amara, watching from across the ocean, saw the photographs splashed across headlines. She told herself it was just a rumor, just another baseless story the press created to tear families apart. But deep down, her heart knew. When Richard returned home, his arms no longer reached for her. His eyes, once filled with warmth, now carried distance. He became restless, impatient, and dismissive. He no longer asked about Ethan's school or kissed his wife good night. Amara tried to confront him one evening after dinner, her voice trembling but steady. "Richard, are you seeing someone else?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring at the amber liquid as if it held the answers. Finally, he muttered, "Don't be ridiculous." But the lie was written all over his face. Vanessa had slipped into their lives like a poison. And slowly, it was killing everything Amara had built with him. The night it happened, the rain beat against the tall glass windows of the Hamilton mansion. Thunder rolled in the distance, but inside the house, it was far quieter, too quiet. Amara sat in the nursery, humming softly as little Ethan slept. She held his tiny hand in hers, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. For all the uncertainty in her marriage, her son was her anchor. She believed, no, she hoped, that Richard would come around. That the man she had once known, the one who promised her forever, was still buried somewhere beneath the arrogance and the whispers of another woman. But when the front doors slammed shut that night, she knew hope was about to die. Richard walked in, his suit drenched from the storm. His face was hard, colder than she had ever seen it. He didn't bother to greet her, didn't ask about Ethan. Instead, he strode into the living room like a man who had made up his mind about something irreversible. "Richard," Amara whispered, following him, "you're home early. What's wrong?" He didn't sit. He didn't even look at her. "Pack your things," he said flatly. The words struck her like lightning. She stared at him, confused. "What do you mean? Pack, why?" His jaw tightened. "Because this," he waved his hand vaguely around the mansion, "isn't working anymore. I've found someone else, someone who belongs in this world. Vanessa makes me happy. You don't." Amara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Her heart raced, her vision blurred. She reached for him, desperate. "Richard, please, we've built a life together. We have a son. Ethan needs his father." Richard finally looked at her, but his eyes were cold, stripped of every ounce of tenderness she had once known. "Ethan will be fine. You'll take care of him. You're good at that. But you don't fit here, Amara. You never did." Her body trembled. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she clutched her chest. "So you're throwing us away? For her?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "For her. I love Vanessa, and she belongs at my side." The finality in his voice shattered her. She felt as though the walls of the mansion were collapsing in on her, suffocating her with betrayal. That night, with rain soaking the streets, Amara gathered a few clothes, a bag of Ethan's essentials, and left the Hamilton estate. She walked out carrying her baby in her arms, her heart splintered into pieces, her world ripped apart by the man she had given everything to. Behind her, Richard stood at the window, watching them go. His reflection in the glass looked powerful, untouchable, even smug. But he had no idea that the decision he made that night would return to haunt him in ways he could never imagine. The first weeks after leaving the Hamilton mansion were the hardest of Amara's life. Gone were the marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and chauffeurs at her beck and call. Now she stood in the rain-soaked streets of New York, clutching Ethan in her arms with nowhere to go. She found a one-bedroom apartment in a run-down neighborhood. The walls were cracked, the heat barely worked, and the sound of sirens was her nightly lullaby. Yet within that tiny space, Amara tried to build a home for her son. Money was scarce. Richard had cut her off completely, leaving her with only the savings she had managed to squirrel away. To keep food on the table, she took on 2 jobs. By day, she scrubbed floors and emptied trash bins in office buildings, her back aching and hands blistered. By night, she worked as a waitress in a small diner, balancing trays with a tired smile while exhaustion gnawed at her bones. Still, she never complained. At the end of each long day, she came home to Ethan, who would greet her with a giggle or a sleepy smile. She would rock him to sleep, whispering promises into the night. "One day, baby," she murmured, kissing his forehead, "you'll have everything they said you couldn't. I'll make sure of it." The people around her began to notice her quiet strength. Neighbors offered babysitting when her shifts ran long. Customers at the diner tipped her a little extra, sensing the weight she carried. But Amara's greatest challenge was not the hunger, not the exhaustion, it was the loneliness. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how the man she had loved so fiercely could cast her and their child aside as though they were disposable. And yet, even in her pain, she never poisoned Ethan's heart against his father. When Ethan was old enough to ask, "Where's Daddy?" Amara forced a smile and said gently, "Daddy's busy. But I'm here. And I'll always be here." Meanwhile, across the city, Richard lived like a king. Tabloids splashed photos of him and Vanessa vacationing on yachts in the Mediterranean, dining at Michelin star restaurants, and attending charity balls arm in arm. Society praised him for his new love, and Vanessa basked in the spotlight, wearing diamonds worth more than Amara's entire apartment building. To the world, Richard had upgraded. But what the cameras didn't show was the fire burning in Ethan's young heart. Even as a child, he noticed the sacrifices his mother made, the strength she showed, and the pain she hid behind her smile. Each time he saw her worn-out shoes or heard her stomach growl when she pretended she wasn't hungry, a vow formed deep inside him. One day, he promised himself, he would rise so high that the world, and his father, would never look down on them again. Time moved forward, carrying with it the echoes of heartbreak and the weight of sacrifice. Ethan grew, not in luxury, but in resilience. By the time he was a teenager, he had already learned lessons most adults never grasped: the value of hard work, the strength of dignity, and the fire of determination. His childhood was marked not by toys and vacations, but by books, late nights at the library, and long talks with his mother. Amara pushed him to dream beyond their circumstances. "You are not defined by what your father did to us," she would tell him, holding his face in her hands. "You are defined by the choices you make and the man you become." Ethan listened. And he excelled. At school, he was a star student, often staying after class to ask teachers questions, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. His brilliance, especially in technology and business, caught the attention of mentors who encouraged him to apply for scholarships. By the age of 17, he had already built small apps that earned him recognition in local competitions. When graduation day came, Ethan stood tall in his cap and gown, his mother cheering louder than anyone else in the crowd. Against all odds, he received a full scholarship to Harvard University. Tears streamed down Amara's face as she hugged him, whispering, "I knew you could do it, baby. I always knew." At Harvard, Ethan was unstoppable. While others partied, he studied. While others dreamed, he built. He developed groundbreaking software that caught the eye of investors, and by the time he was 25, he had founded his own tech company. His innovation shook the industry, and soon the world was speaking his name. Ethan Hamilton, the self-made billionaire. Magazines splashed his face across covers, calling him the genius son of a forgotten wife. Interviews celebrated his rise from humble beginnings to the heights of success. Unlike his father, Ethan built his empire not on arrogance, but on integrity, vision, and a determination to prove his mother's sacrifices were not in vain. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Richard Hamilton's empire had begun to crumble. Years of reckless spending, bad investments, and blind trust in Vanessa were catching up with him. His once mighty real estate holdings faced lawsuits, debts piled high, and investors fled like birds from a burning forest. And Vanessa. She was no longer the devoted mistress who whispered promises. She had grown distant, distracted, and greedy. Whispers of betrayal circled around her name. The stage was being set for a shocking twist of fate. For years, Richard had mocked Amara, dismissed Ethan, and basked in his illusions of superiority. But soon, the very son he threw away would stand higher than him, and the world would watch. For decades, Richard Hamilton was a man who believed he was untouchable. His name opened doors, his fortune silenced critics, and his influence stretched across boardrooms and governments alike. But power, like a castle built on sand, cannot stand forever. The cracks began quietly. A risky investment in an overseas property collapsed, costing him millions. Then, a scandal involving shady tax shelters spread across the news. Investors who once begged to shake his hand now pulled their money out of his projects. But the deepest betrayal came from within. Vanessa, the woman for whom he had destroyed his marriage, was no longer by his side in loyalty. For years, she had been siphoning money into secret accounts, funneling Richard's fortune into her own empire. He ignored the warning signs, lavish shopping sprees, unexplained absences, and her sudden business ventures. He told himself she was his partner, that she loved him. Until the day she vanished. One morning, Richard awoke to silence. The walk-in closet that once held rows of her designer dresses was empty. Her jewelry boxes, her perfumes, her presents, gone. She had left a single note on the marble counter. "Thanks for everything, Richard. Don't bother looking for me. You won't find me." With her departure, the facade of Richard's world crumbled completely. Lawsuits piled on his desk, banks seized properties, and headlines mocked his fall from grace. The man once hailed as America's real estate king was reduced to a broken figure drowning in debt and disgrace. He sold cars, houses, even the mansion that once echoed with Ethan's childhood laughter. But it was never enough. For the first time in his life, Richard Hamilton was alone. No family, no fortune, no love. In his desperation, he began searching for a lifeline, anyone powerful enough to pull him from the abyss. That's when he saw the face on a Forbes magazine cover. Ethan Hamilton, the tech billionaire who's changing the world. The headline cut like a blade. His son, the boy he had abandoned, the child he had called unworthy, was now wealthier, more respected, and more powerful than he had ever been. The irony was merciless. And for Richard, it was the final humiliation. He realized that if he was to survive, if there was any chance of redemption, he would have to go to the very people he had discarded. He would have to face Amara and the son who had every reason to hate him. With shaking hands and a heart heavy with regret, Richard Hamilton picked up the phone and requested a meeting. The stage was set for a reunion that would shock the world. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ding, revealing the top floor of Hamilton Innovations, Ethan's empire. The office stretched across the skyline, glass walls revealing a sweeping view of New York City. It was sleek, modern, and powerful, Everything Richard once prided himself on, but bigger, bolder, and built by the very son he had abandoned. Richard stepped out, his once confident stride now reduced to a weary shuffle. His expensive suit was outdated, wrinkled, and hung loosely on a body thinned by stress. For the first time in his life, he felt small. A secretary led him into the executive office. And there he was, Ethan Hamilton, tall, poised, and commanding. He wore a sharp navy suit, but it wasn't the clothes that gave him presence. It was the fire in his eyes, the quiet authority in his stance. He had his mother's dignity and his father's ambition, but refined into something stronger, something untouchable. Sitting near the window, her posture graceful as ever, was Amara. Time had touched her, adding strands of silver to her hair, but she was radiant. Her calmness, her strength, her poise, it was as though betrayal had only polished her into something unbreakable. Richard froze. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat. He had expected anger, maybe hatred. Instead, what he saw was worse, indifference. Neither Ethan nor Amara rushed to greet him. They simply looked at him, waiting. "Ethan," Richard's voice cracked. "My son." Ethan didn't move. His expression was unreadable, his jaw tight. "I stopped being your son the night you threw us out." The words hit Richard like a slap. He turned desperately toward Amara, but her eyes were steady, cold, filled with a quiet strength he couldn't penetrate. "I've lost everything," Richard confessed, his knees trembling as he lowered himself into a chair. "The company, the money, even Vanessa. She betrayed me. I have nothing left. Please, please, help me." For a long moment, silence filled the office. The hum of the city below was the only sound. Richard's eyes darted between the son who had become greater than he ever dreamed, and the woman he had discarded who now radiated more dignity than he ever possessed. Finally, Ethan leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. "You want my help now? After you left us to starve? After you chose her over us?" Richard's lips trembled. "I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But I'm still your father." Ethan's expression hardened. "A father protects. A father sacrifices. You were never that man. My mother was both mother and father to me. She raised me. She made me who I am. You're just the man who gave me his name." Richard's eyes welled with tears. For the first time in years, the once mighty billionaire wept openly, his pride shattered. But Ethan wasn't moved. He stood, his presence towering over the man who had once cast him aside. "I built my empire without you, and I don't owe you a single thing." The silence that followed was deafening. Amara finally spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "Richard, life has a way of returning to us what we give. You gave us abandonment, and now you live in abandonment. You gave us betrayal, and now you've been betrayed. That's not punishment, it's justice." Richard lowered his head, unable to speak. He had come seeking mercy but found only truth. The weight of silence pressed down on the office like a stone. Richard sat hunched, his hands trembling, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a broken man. He had come seeking pity, maybe forgiveness, but what he found was judgment, the kind that doesn't shout, but cuts deeper because it is calm, certain, and true. Ethan stood tall behind his desk, his voice steady as he spoke. "You taught me something, Richard. When you left us, you showed me what happens when a man values money more than love. You showed me that pride destroys families. You showed me that greed always ends in emptiness." Richard swallowed hard, his lips parting to respond, but Ethan's voice grew firmer. "I built my empire because Mom taught me dignity. I studied hard because she worked double shifts to keep me fed. I learned strength because she cried in silence and still got up every morning to fight for me. Everything I am, everything I've achieved, I owe to her. Not to you." Amara's eyes softened, tears glistening as she looked at her son. Pride radiated from her, but she said nothing. This was Ethan's moment. Richard leaned forward, his voice cracking. "Please, Ethan. I'm your father. Don't let me die with nothing." Ethan's jaw clenched. He took a deep breath before answering, each word deliberate. "You had everything, and you chose to throw it away. You had a wife who loved you, a son who needed you, a home filled with love. But you traded it all for vanity. You don't get to come back when the world turns on you. Life doesn't work that way." Richard's face crumpled. His tears dripped onto the polished floor, his sobs filling the room. The image of power and wealth that had once defined him was gone. Now he was just a broken man begging for scraps of mercy. Ethan's voice softened, but it carried the weight of finality. "You are no longer part of my story. You're just a lesson." Amara finally spoke, her tone calm, almost gentle, but firm as stone. "Richard, if you want redemption, it won't come from us. It has to come from the life you still have left to live. Go and face it alone, just as you made me face life alone all those years ago." Richard lifted his head slowly, his eyes hollow. He realized then that the punishment wasn't anger, it was rejection. It was being erased from the very lives he had once discarded. The guards at the office door approached quietly, waiting for Ethan's signal. Ethan gave a simple nod. Richard rose shakily to his feet. His body felt heavier than it ever had, weighed down not by wealth but by regret. He looked at his son one last time, his lips trembling with words he couldn't form. Then, without another sound, he turned and walked out of the office, the doors closing behind him with a soft, final click. The once mighty billionaire had fallen, and there was no one left to catch him. The city's skyline glowed under the evening sun, skyscrapers shining like monuments of ambition and perseverance. Somewhere high above, in the top floor of an office tower that bore his name, Ethan sat beside Amara, reviewing documents for their next major charitable foundation. Their story was now one of success, dignity, and healing, living proof that love and hard work could turn pain into triumph. But across the city, in a small, dimly lit apartment, Richard lived in shadows. His wealth had slipped through his fingers like sand. The mistress who had once clung to him for status abandoned him the moment his empire collapsed. Friends turned their backs, creditors stripped him of assets, and the once celebrated billionaire was left with nothing but the echo of his own mistakes. Neighbors whispered when they saw him, an aging man, frail and forgotten, who used to be someone of importance. He shuffled through the streets, his expensive suits pawned long ago, now dressed in second-hand clothes. He carried not a briefcase of contracts, but a small bag of regrets. One night, sitting alone in the flickering light of a single bulb, Richard stared at an old photograph he had dug from the bottom of a box. It showed him with Amara and baby Ethan, smiles wide, love radiating, a family unbroken. His fingers trembled as tears blurred his sight. He whispered hoarsely into the silence, "I had it all, and I threw it away." Days turned into months. His name disappeared from headlines. The world moved on, but his torment stayed. And one cold morning, Richard was found alone in his apartment, his life ending in silence. No family, no friends, no empire to bear witness. Meanwhile, Amara and Ethan stood together on the stage of a global conference, their foundation opening opportunities for struggling families. The crowd rose in applause, but Amara's eyes were on her son, pride filling her heart. Ethan smiled at her and spoke into the microphone. This is not just my story. It is my mother's story. She taught me that true wealth is not counted in money, but in love, in dignity, and in the lives we lift up. Everything I am, I owe to her." The applause thundered. Cameras flashed. But in that moment, for Amara, the only thing that mattered was knowing that her sacrifice had blossomed into something beautiful. As the night closed in, the contrast could not have been clearer. Richard, once rich but loveless, had died forgotten. Amara, once discarded, stood taller than ever. And Ethan, the baby abandoned by his father, became the man who shocked the world with not only his success but his humanity. The story ended not in revenge, but in justice. Life had balanced the scales, and the world would forever remember the lesson. Money fades, power crumbles, but love endures.